Hey guys, if you read the title before you clicked on this video, then you know I'm going to address the question of the interpretation of a particular story written by George R.R. Martin by a particular interpreter, a famous commentator on the literature, Preston Jacobs. Before I get to that, I'm going to say a few words about myself and my interest in A Song of Ice and Fire / George R.R. Martin. For some of you, this is the first time you've ever seen my channel. For some of you, you've been watching my channel steadily and you're sitting there wondering, what is this? Because I don't think I've ever had another video talking about fiction, unless you consider rap music fiction. In a sense, it is. Some of it's nonfiction. I don't want to hazard a guess as to what percentage. But look, I do roll with A Song of Ice and Fire heavy. I've been reading the books for years, and I've been planning to come on YouTube and contribute my voice to the debates surrounding the interpretation of the book for years. And during the last several months, several times I've invited other people to come on my channel and talk about it with me. One of the reasons being I actually didn't want to talk about the books in this kind of overly intense staring into the camera format. I thought it'd be better to have a more casual two-person conversation, or 3 or 4 people in a roundtable format to take the edge off a bit, because it gets intense. My main interest, my first university degree is in political science, and the themes that interest me most in the books are political philosophy. There's a lot of, for me, really moving, really interesting political content in the books. Sometimes you meet people who read the books for like the teen romance, people who are really interested in who is going to be Sansa Stark's next boyfriend. I don't have anything against those people, but I think even if you're that kind of fan of the book, you like the romantic elements, I think you have to admit, as a work of literature, A Song of Ice and Fire, or the canon of George R.R. Martin, it would have never stood out on the strength of its romantic elements. It really stands out, on the one hand, because of its world building, but on the other hand, really because of the strength of its political content, its political philosophy, its reflections on political themes. And I would say those two are linked. The world building would be meaningless without the strange sense of political realism that's woven into that world. So that's the intro. My specific topic for this video is the interpretation or misinterpretation of a George R.R. Martin story from the 1970s called And Seven Times Never Kill Man, addressed by Preston Jacobs. This is not a hate video against Preston Jacobs. Preston Jacobs is one of these guys who goes way out on a limb in his interpretations. Sometimes he's right, sometimes he's wrong, and as he says, sometimes he's wrong about half of this stuff. Preston went way out on a limb not too long ago in interpreting a series of stories by George R.R. Martin in the Tough Voyaging series as all being a set of philosophical reflections on the philosophy of Plato's Republic. And I remember from the first time he started talking about that, I disagreed with him. I just thought he was dead wrong. I don't think the author had that in mind. And then it's a really funny thing, but Preston met the author. It's a very rare thing for someone who's a literary critic to meet the author whose work he's commenting on. And Preston got to confirm for himself that no, those stories were not about the philosophy of Plato. They were not about Plato's Republic at all. However, for those of you who are watching the story and have no idea why a guy like me would be interested in George R.R. Martin, already this tells you why, the material is actually sophisticated enough, it is interesting enough to really keep my eyes on the page. I feel that Preston totally fundamentally missed the point of this story. And in a sense, he missed the plot of the story and the fundamental plot twist. So if you don't know, if you haven't read the story, you haven't heard what Preston has to say about it, at the beginning of this story, the plot begins, the fundamental basis for the plot is that a trader in antiquities, he doesn't only trade, he's a trader generally, arrives on a planet and he is trying to make money out of selling the ancient art, the traditional religious art of an alien civilization on an alien planet. That's the fundamental basis for the plot. Now, obviously it doesn't sound that exciting, but we get comments on the art, on the sculptures of these people from different perspectives as the plot goes ahead. It's a leitmotif that they come back to. And then at the end, the plot twist is revealed through those statues, through the interpretation of the works of art. Preston completely misses this. What are we told about the works of art? They're worthless because they're too human. Alien art is supposed to be exotic and represent an alien civilization. And instead, when these works of art were presented to experts, they said, no, these are by human beings. These represent human religions, human gods. They've just been made alien in style, but this is not actually alien art. I realize I'm not quoting the book directly. I'm paraphrasing what is revealed in that, right? But I mean, directly you're told they're so certain that these are human. This is human culture, human religion, human gods in these statues, that the other character comes in at the end of the story, says it's ridiculous. He must have trained these aliens to make an imitation of human art, human culture. And we know he didn't do that if we're reading the story beginning to end. Okay? And the second thing that's significant for understanding George's style of writing, and is significant for A Song of Ice and Fire also, is that George very often gives us, shall we say, very spare, very select physical descriptions of characters, including magical characters who have very strange appearances, or aliens, or elves, or whatever you're going to say. So like in A Song of Ice and Fire, many people read the books and they think they've had a very good description of what the Children of the Forest looks like. Their imagination is filled in the blanks. But then when they go back on a second reading, or they look around on the internet and they put together the physical description, the author has given you almost nothing to work with. The description, there's a very intentional evasion of any physical description of what these characters look like, right? So in this story, George, again, this is part of his style. He does this quite intentionally in many different stories in different contexts and throughout A Song of Ice and Fire. Although not always. That's also interesting. Some of the groups that are not so important to the plot, we do get a very full description of. So it's intentional when he omits these things, and it's intentional what he includes. The one feature that is very clear throughout the story, George describes their eyes. So the Janchi, however you want to pronounce them, these supposed aliens who made the sculptures, who made the artifacts that the protagonist is trying to trade at the beginning of the story, their eyes are golden in color. And we get many descriptions of their eyes, right? And at the end of the story, the human colonists, who are being, in a sense, brainwashed by the planet, it's a little bit mysterious what's going on. They're being brainwashed by the gods of this planet, by these religious/technological icons, all part of the story. Their eyes are turning gold. There's flecks of gold in the eyes of the brainwashed character, right? So these are the two pieces of evidence the reader is presented with. The gold eyes that are mentioned 100 times, and again, the statues that are mentioned 100 times. And Preston misses both of them utterly. He completely misses the point. Preston does correctly notice that the story suggests at the beginning that these aliens, presumed aliens, they seem to have regressed, that in the past they had a more advanced civilization and they now have a less regressed civilization. The point is, when you read the whole story beginning to end, your conclusion must be they regressed from being human beings. They used to be human. They used to have a human civilization. Again, the description of them, I mean, Preston just vaguely says, well, they're ape-like. Their features have changed somewhat from being human beings. But we already see that happen with the other human colonists, with their eyes turning gold and their whole society is transformed, etc., etc. Now, obviously, I don't need to spell it out. Most of the story is a set of reflections on religious authority, on religion, and considerable space is given to the fact that the people who believe in these religions simply don't ask questions and simply don't have answers for questions that seem so obvious and essential. There's a lot of material devoted to that. I think that's self-explanatory. I don't think I need to interpret that for you on YouTube. The story does a good enough job of telling that. But in terms of what Preston missed, there are only two possible interpretations of the statues, which again, it's not subtle. They're there in the beginning of the story, they're crucial at the end of the story, and they're mentioned during. Either the statues mean that these people used to be human. That's, I think, the clearest interpretation. Or you interpret it to mean that these people on this planet have repeatedly received human visitors and have repeatedly repelled the human visitors by assimilating their culture, by appropriating human religion, human idols, that this has happened again and again. Now, actually, if you read the story, that's not what it's suggesting. including the fact that we're told about the history of the planet, etc. So, and the other thing is that second interpretation, if you think it's wave after wave of human colonists that's given them this culture, these religious icons, that doesn't explain the issue of the gold eyes and the fact that the human religious leader, the colonist, who's now assimilating into the planet, into the pattern of how that planet works, that his eyes are turning gold in color. So that's it. Now, again, not hating on Preston, I think this is a really interesting example, as with his former attempt to completely reinterpret one of the stories of George Martin in terms of the philosophy of Plato, where Preston has gone through the story with a fine-tooth comb, and yet he's missed the central element of the plot. He's missed the main plot twist. He's missed what the story is all about. I'm not going to come out here and boast that I'm better at this kind of interpretation than Preston Jacobs. I do have a background in interpreting and explaining Buddhist philosophy, European philosophy, and a lot of stuff about politics. I come from a very, very different background, and I think I have a very, very different set of thematic concerns when I look at these texts. But it is true that in each case, in each story, or even if you look at A Song of Ice and Fire as a series of short stories, in many ways the book, it is written, it's one enormous book that's written as a series of short stories. You learn to appreciate the economy of language George uses. The color of the eyes thing, it's not verbose, right? Where just a few words he's putting in there that's crucial to understanding what's going on or why it matters. And again, I think that's also why George is not considered a great romance novelist. It's not great for describing love. But, you know, for me, that can be very moving. Some of the little moments where George turns a key for you politically like that. I'll just mention one before I hit stop on this video. You know, the fact that in his fictional world, even the worst political leaders, there are some people around who remember them as great leaders or as good kings. That's very moving to me in its way, even though it's very simple. The fact that, you know, the Mad King himself, there are still some peasants who will say, hey, you know, this was a better society. This was a better kingdom when the Mad King... And you get them again, just a few words, just a few sentences, and you realize the richness and the realism of his manner of painting a political world. And that's something, I mean, again, for me, that's moving. I know for a lot of you might read those passages about politics, and it may have an intellectual effect on you, but not an emotional effect. But I've lived in Cambodia, where the worst political leaders imaginable, the worst disasters imaginable involving the deaths of huge numbers of people, you still meet people who will tell you that from their perspective, it wasn't all bad. So that's it. My first video on George R.R. Martin, A Song of Ice and Fire on this channel. There will be more. You have been warned. Hit me up.